Hi, everybody. This is Laura Herman. I am the Deputy Executive Director of ECA, and we're going to get started here in a couple minutes. We've got a few more people that are dialing in and getting all of their Zoom settings right, so we'll start here in a minute or two. Thanks for joining us today. This session is being recorded and will be available on the ECA YouTube site at some point in the future.
This is where we should play Price is Right music.
This is the Price is Right music. That's good. I'm trying to figure out how to change my my own view.
Oh, yeah.
So. Great. I've been looking forward to this conversation since we started lining this up. I think we've got a lot of good content to cover today. And all right. It's a couple of minutes after the hour, so I think we'll go ahead and get started so we can take full advantage of everybody's time this afternoon. And I want to thank everybody again for joining. Laura Herman, the Deputy Executive Director at ECA, Energy Communities Alliance. And I'm looking forward to this conversation on reprocessing. And this is a topic that I think has gotten a lot of attention since we had some executive orders come out from the Trump administration. And it's a conversation that has been present within the nuclear industry for a long time. So I think this is a really good opportunity to bring together some experts to share with us some different perspectives on reprocessing, recycling, all of the different fuel cycle technologies that are available so that we can better understand what some of the options are that are under discussion today. With me, I have three great resources on this topic, and I'll do some brief introductions and then let everybody introduce themselves as we kick off this conversation. What we want to do today is sort of introduce the topic of reprocessing, talk a little bit about the context around not only the technology, but the policies that enable it, and then talk about the value, why it's a conversation that we keep coming back to in the United States as well as internationally. And hopefully that will give people a good sort of snapshot around the state of play for this technology and the research and development that's gone into it. So with me today, I have Ross Matzkin-Bridger, who is the Senior Director for Nuclear Materials Security at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. And Ross and I got to start this conversation earlier this year at the Energy Communities Alliance New Nuclear Forum in Idaho Falls, which I think was a great place to start this conversation. Ross had joined me on a conversation about building out the nuclear ecosystem. And that session, we discussed some of the opportunities for the public and private sector to really leverage some of the expertise and lessons learned that will keep new nuclear moving forward. And as we see new companies coming to market with some of these advanced nuclear technologies that include reprocessing, this is an opportunity for us to dig a little bit deeper into that conversation that we started in April at the forum. And since we started in Idaho Falls, this conversation, it also makes sense to have Kemal Pasamehmetoglu join us. Kemal had been with Idaho National Laboratory and recently retired. So now he can give us the real skinny on things. And but better than that, Kemal had really started his career at Los Alamos and then moved to work on energy issues at Idaho National Laboratory. And now that he's serving as a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, I think it gives us an opportunity to really look at his career in a whole, because I think it's a really fascinating evolution of programs in the national laboratories that have dealt with these fuel cycle issues. And since Kemal served as the associate lab director from 2012 to 2017, he's really had a role in helping shape all of these different advanced fuel research and development programs, some of the key initiatives around fuel cycle research and development, and the Global Nuclear Energy Partnership, which is, I think, the last time about 10 years ago that we had a big federal push on reprocessing technologies. And then finally, we have Nick Turan, who is the founder and the main force behind the website What is Nuclear? And a self-described man with a mission to save and revive the history around many of the amazing activities that take us back to the beginning of the nuclear age. I, I know Nick from his role at TerraPower, where he worked for 16 years on really helping TerraPower evaluate the different nuclear fuel cycles that have informed the development of their technology pathways. And with a PhD from the University of Michigan in nuclear engineering, I think that it really focused on fast reactors. Nick brings a great technical body of knowledge too, and how it has played in the private sector as well as the R&D side. So we've got a really nice range of folks here with different experiences and really deep knowledge. I think with Ross and his foreign service background, working for the US government at both NNSA, but also as the energy attaché in the embassy in Tokyo, Ross brings this really great geopolitical perspective that has also been an important driver behind reprocessing conversations. And we'll talk a bit more as to why. And with Ross's more recent role at NTI, we'll be able to talk about the efforts to sort of shape thinking around this technology and its path forward. So that's a sort of brief overview. What I am really excited about this discussion for is that we have three people who are not necessarily here to sell us any technology. And so they have private sector or government experience, but are now working on the sort of adjacent areas and can really help us think about these topics from an objective, independent standpoint as we look at what the possible pathways are forward with fuel cycle solutions. And so I'm very excited about that perspective. And I want to I'll start with you, Ross. If you could talk a little bit more about your background and what you bring to this conversation today, so we can kind of set up some goals for our discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Laura. Thanks for having me here today. Thanks to all of you for taking a portion of your day to come listen to us. As Laura mentioned, I'm Ross Matzkin-Bridger with NTI. A lot of what I am doing these days in the nonprofit space is working to really build out that nuclear energy ecosystem in a way that is cost effective, in a way that can be scaled as quickly as possible, and safely and securely as well. In terms of how I got here, though, I actually need to go way back, even before the start of my professional career. So I grew up kind of moving around to different places in the United States because my parents' jobs. But I was taken to what ended up being several different communities that had nuclear power plants either in them or directly adjacent. First in Michigan, close to the Fermi nuclear power station, and then in New Hampshire, close to Seabrook. And it was a really great experience for me to see this infrastructure. I was just awed by that we could produce all this electricity without emissions. I saw, from not only my family, but communities' families, families across the community, the jobs that it created in the community. And so from a very early age, I kind of had this really a great experience with nuclear energy. As I then started my career, I first started in the National Nuclear Security Administration. And so then I was looking at nuclear from a bit of a different angle. And I was working on nonproliferation, nuclear security programs, mainly going to former Soviet countries that had kind of legacy weapons programs or legacy weapons materials, and how we can clean that up, get rid of the weapons usable material while keeping the really good research that were done at these legacy facilities. Um, I then moved on to the Department of Energy, where I was working on a much broader set of energy portfolio, nuclear energy, but then also fossil energy, renewables. I got really a sense of where nuclear kind of fits into the larger mix. And also got kind of direct experience with waste management and the legacy that that nuclear energy has with that as well. And so, you know, from my perspective, working on all these issues, I still see nuclear as such a great opportunity, nuclear energy as such a great opportunity for the future of the United States in terms of the electricity demand that we have and that we're going to continue to have. And so I think it's a great part of the solution set. I do think, though, we need to be focused really, really laser focused on how do we make nuclear energy, how do we scale it as quickly as possible. We have some great ambition, right? In the latest executive orders, we have an ambition to quadruple nuclear energy capacity by 2050. We want to do it cost effectively, of course, and we want to do it safely and securely. So the question really is, how do we best approach nuclear energy to make these ambitions a reality? And so that's where we turn to the question of reprocessing that's before us today. And so, you know, in my experience, what I see is that I see reprocessing, unfortunately, as something that doesn't really help achieve these goals, and at times actually helps exacerbate the problems that these goals actually face. And so my perspective is, yes, we want to move forward with nuclear energy. Let's focus on this ambition. Reprocessing, though, is a bit of a distraction that takes us in other directions and not really focused on where we want to be.
Thanks, Ross. I appreciate that your introduction, and I think it's great to hear the impression that a power plant can make on a young person, just like driving by. That's I think a nice. I didn't know that about you, so I think it's a fun fact. And you know, I think you present a clear perspective on this. Nick, I would like to go to you since you are coming from a company that has really set out to commercialize some of these technologies and might have a different perspective on it.
Well, yeah. So hi everyone, Nick Turan. Very happy to be here. And just brief background. I mean, Laura covered it pretty well. I grew up 9 miles from an operating nuclear power plant. I can't say it had that much of an impact on me early on. I kind of just, it was a thing that was nearby. But I really got into nuclear when I went to the good local university, which was University of Michigan, and they happened to have a nuclear program. And I wanted to do energy independence type stuff, energy abundance, as we call it now. And when I found that nuclear department, I was hooked. I learned all this stuff about nuclear and was like, wow, this is not only is this a very capable energy source, but it's also not doing very well. And so what an opportunity, you know, something I can really maybe have an impact on. So I dug in and got into first fusion. I was like, fusion is the way. And then I learned about advanced fission and did a lot of work on sodium cooled fast reactors, in particular with reprocessing, basically the IFR type stuff. And I learned how to simulate those reactors and plug in different fuel cycles. I learned a lot about thorium. We tried burning thorium in sodium cooled fast reactors. Just became like a sodium fast reactor guy. And then along came TerraPower, and they were looking for people who could model and simulate basically sodium cooled fast reactors. And when I was first learning, my colleagues in school thought, why would you do a sodium reactor? We don't have any of those. And then TerraPower came along just at the right time. So I got the job relatively easily. Well, But it was different because I had been a big proponent of reprocessing with fast reactors. It's, all the sustainability, the waste treatment, all the things we'll talk about soon about reprocessing. But TerraPower came along and said, no, we don't want to reprocess. We want all the benefits of reprocessing, but we don't want to reprocess at all. And so this was the original concept of what is called the traveling wave reactor. It's basically just a deep burn once through cycle. So instead of breeding up plutonium and then extracting it and fabricating new fuel, you breed up plutonium and you just leave it in there and then burn it right down. So breed and burn is another phrase or term for that. And so I was like, okay, I guess I can get on board with that. It's not as good as reprocessing from the purist point of view. You don't get the waste treatment capability and you only get maybe 30% of the total energy out as opposed to 90%, which you could get with reprocessing. But hey, 30 is a lot better than 0.5%, which is what non-breeder, non-reprocessing type reactors do. So anyway, turns out though there's a big challenge, which is that to leave fuel in a reactor environment for a very long time is very challenging from a materials point of view. It's hard to live inside a nuclear reactor at high temperature with neutrons and fission products all around you for as long as it takes to do that. So it's sort of trading off a reprocessing challenge for a materials and fuels challenge. Well, anyway, so where I've come is like, I also have been promoting nuclear, all the things Ross said about finding the ways to get nuclear built quickly. Like I totally align with that. And I found myself sort of standing in between this space where I like reprocessing. I think we actually do need, if we want significant fraction of our power from nuclear on this planet, we need reprocessing. Like I actually do believe that. But I also agree with Ross that like getting there now is hard and there are challenges, there's costs, there's concerns, there's low-level waste issues. And so I'm like in the middle where I find myself criticizing or fighting against the very pro reprocessing people and also fighting against the no reprocessing at all people. So anyway, we'll find out where it goes in the conversation. So I'll stop there.
That's great. Thanks,
Yeah.
Nick. I think that's part of what we want to, I think that's happening nationally. And when everybody figures out what are the best paths forward, how do we help the companies succeed that are trying to roll out these technologies and what needs to be addressed to get there. Kemal, if you would be so kind as to kind of give us a little bit in terms of what you're working on now and what brings you into this conversation today.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate you joining us for this discussion. I always find this discussion very fruitful, especially when we are looking at the problem from both sides, no reprocessing versus full reprocessing, and eventually I think we'll settle somewhere in the middle. As Laura indicated, I've spent my career 40 years at national laboratories, and I have been involved in almost every fuel cycle and waste-related issue that we had to deal with in the last 40 years. The first 20 years at Los Alamos was mostly on the defense programs, production reactors, and the fuel cycles associated with the production reactors. Then the last 20 years, mostly on the civilian, the advanced reactors and recycling in advanced reactors. My last job before I retired was the versatile test reactor. Ross mentioned the ecosystem, and part of the ecosystem was the infrastructure we were lacking at the time, especially if we are going to go in the direction of fast reactors and recycling. So we tried to build a test reactor at very high flux, sodium-cooled fast reactor. Budget constraints didn't allow us to finish that, but that's something this country really needs as we move forward. And eventually, I think we'll get it. Currently, after I retired, I am working with the Atlantic Council on the national scene, and I'm participating in discussions and trying to formulate a path forward on reprocessing. But that is within the context of the national scene, as well as what it will take for US to retake the leadership in nuclear energy, the global leadership in nuclear energy. So reprocessing certainly, and dealing with the spent fuel plays a role in that. I have also been continuing after I retired on behalf of DOE, chairing the Nuclear Science Committee in OECD NEA. So on the international side, in the last couple of years, there was a big interest, especially after now we are talking about quadrupling the nuclear energy. A couple of years ago, in the previous administration, we were talking about tripling the nuclear energy. Either one is difficult, but when you start talking about those kind of numbers, recycling and reprocessing comes into the discussion right away. And we were not the only ones talking about tripling the nuclear output, where there were other advanced nuclear countries who were looking into it, and their automatic solution was also, well, if we are going to go there, we gotta speed up the reprocessing side of things as well. So it is a new strategic initiative in the OECD NEA to start looking at reprocessing in a global sense. What makes sense, what doesn't make sense, and what are the missing science pieces versus what are the missing policy pieces, especially on the international side of things. And what kind of partnerships are possible, what partnerships are not possible. So I am still doing that as well. So in a nutshell, yes, I am a big proponent of nuclear energy. I've always been. I cannot say that my views on the type of reactors versus the type of fuel cycles haven't changed over the years. They have changed. And especially as the market evolved, obviously, when the market slowed down, you look at the problem with a different perspective. All of a sudden, if we are talking about tripling and quadrupling nuclear in really 20 years, which in nuclear terms is nothing, it's a very short period of time, then you look at the problem in a totally different perspective. Unlike Rostow, and I do believe that the only way, if you are going to get close to tripling and quadrupling nuclear energy, I don't think reprocessing is a distraction. I think reprocessing is an enabler, because when I do the math, I do not see how we can get there globally without reprocessing and by throwing away 99.5% of the natural resources. So I'll stop there.
That's great.
That will create enough of a controversy for the rest of the discussion.
Everyone's thrown down the gauntlet. We're ready now. We can move on with the conversation. No, thank you, Kemal. That's great. And Nick, you mentioned the IFR, which I believe is the integral fast reactor.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And Kemal mentioned the VTR, the versatile test reactor. Nick, since you run a website called What is Nuclear, for those among us who are just getting up to speed because this is new to us, can you simplify, give us the quick overview when we talk about the fuel cycle as it relates to reprocessing? What exactly are we talking about?
Okay, yeah, I'll try to be brief. Just wave me down if I go too far. So, okay, hi everyone again. So fuel cycle just means like you're digging up material out of the earth, you're doing something with it, and then you're left with something, and you're doing something in a reactor with it to do something useful. Usually make electricity, maybe do propulsion or industrial heat or desalinate, whatever. But like, so fuel cycle is that whole process of mining and then doing chemistry and refabricating into like a certain fuel form. There's many different types of fuel. Usually it's solid ceramic uranium oxide fuel. You can also have many different forms of fuel. You can have liquid fuel, you can have gaseous or plasma fuel, you name it. You can get it into that fuel. There are two natural resources in fission that we use. There's uranium that we dig up, and it has a tiny fraction of it. 0.7% is this uranium-235 isotope, which is what most reactors today are splitting to make nuclear power. There's the 99.3% is this other isotope, uranium-238, which doesn't usually split that much and is almost, it's like wasted for the most part. But it could be used. There's a way to use it, which is if you can invest a single neutron in it, it converts to plutonium-239, which is then just like that minor isotope. And so we call it fissile. It splits readily and it can sustain a nuclear chain reaction. So if you have a special reactor that has extra neutrons and you can invest those extra neutrons into this uranium-238, you can then unlock 200 times more energy out of that natural resource, and this is this is called breeding. Now, when you're doing that, in a typical reactor, as I was saying earlier, you can only run the fuel in that reactor for so long before the fuel itself sort of falls apart. So what you generally would do is you would take that fuel out, you would then melt it down in acid or something else and do chemistry to separate out, take the atoms that have already been split and remove them, take the plutonium and fabricate it into new fuel, put that in another reactor, and then maybe take the uranium that's left and maybe fabricate it back into another one of these blanket type things, which is the targets that you irradiate to turn into plutonium. So this is like a typical fast breeder reactor fuel cycle, and it's something that many countries have tried for many, many years. And in the very early days, in the Manhattan Project, the scientists thought there were only a few thousand tons of uranium on Earth, period. And so they thought, well, the only way we can do anything besides weapons with nuclear power is to breed and to reprocess. That was the early thought. And so that's why one of the first reactors ever to make electricity in the early 50s was a breeder reactor, the experimental breeder reactor 1 out in Idaho. As it turned out, come 1955 to 58, there was a huge uranium discovery. We found so much uranium, you couldn't believe it. And so the importance of breeding was basically zeroed out. It was like, oh, never mind. We have so much uranium that we can just mine it, enrich it, throw it in a reactor, and go. And that was cheaper, simpler. There's a lot fewer processes. The reactors were simpler and more compact. You can use like a regular water-cooled reactor instead of an exotic sodium-cooled whatever reactor, which are my favorite. Anyway, and so that's that. So this has kind of gone back and forth a few times. Like once we commercialized light water non-breeder reactors, we thought we were going to build hundreds of them and power some large fraction of the world. And so the U.S. government and many other governments around the world decided, let's focus all of our research on breeder reactors. And so like in the US, we worked on something called the Clinch River Breeder Reactor Project through the 70s, from late 60s to mid 80s. And that was a boondoggle and got canceled partially because nuclear flatlined. We didn't need the extra fuel, and nuclear became unpopular, and that reactor got stupidly expensive, and people were concerned about proliferation and many other things. And that similar story happened like around the world. Like you pick a country and we can talk about their breeder program. French had Super Phoenix. Meanwhile, I'll just briefly mention there is another natural resource nuclide called thorium. So instead of digging up uranium, you can dig up thorium, and it has it has no atoms in it whatsoever that can split directly, but you can make a breeder reactor out of thorium. So if you have some enriched uranium or plutonium and you throw some thorium in there, that can breed another nuclide called uranium-233, which again has this magic property where it can sustain a chain reaction. So there's a whole nother line of breeder reactors that are the thorium breeder reactors that we've actually put thorium in quite a few reactors. Indian Point 1 was a thorium breeder reactor. Germany had the THTR-300, which is a thorium breeder reactor, gas-cooled reactor with triso fuel. They reprocess the triso. Anyway, and so
there's lots of different technology.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah.
Sorry. Tested,
yeah.
And we can talk more about how that, like, what's been tested versus what has been scaled. Ross, I know you were in Japan, which also has a robust reprocessing history. Do you want to reflect on this question around how we can understand, for those that are new to this, what does the fuel cycle look like there?
Yeah, absolutely. Japan and maybe about 4 other countries have really worked at trying to build large-scale reprocessing. And so, I think very much as kind of Nick described, right? The idea, at least in theory, right? So that's the idea. The idea is you take the spent fuel, you dissolve this instead of disposing of the spent fuel directly, you dissolve the spent fuel into its constituent components, and you would try to extract the plutonium to use again in another round of fuel. What we have seen in Japan, as well as really the other countries that have pursued reprocessing, is that kind of what the theory behind reprocessing and how it kind of actually has worked in the real world has been quite different. So what's actually happened in Japan is that, in the late 1980s is when they decided, hey, look, we're going to build a big reprocessing facility. We want to take advantage of spent fuel as a resource. And I get it. Like, it sounds amazing, right? That facility, a Rokasho reprocessing plant, was supposed to come online, I believe, in 1998. We're still waiting for it to come into commercial operation. They've spent an awful lot of money on it, that's for sure. They have run it a little bit in some like test pilot phases. They have, through that, amassed quite a stockpile of weapons usable plutonium, which is a concern. And then, yeah, they've just spent an awful lot of money, but not really solved any of the problems that the facility was there to solve. It has not solved their waste issue. It has not made things any cheaper. Quite the contrary, it's made their fuel cycle more expensive. And so I think it's a very similar story in the other countries that have also pursued reprocessing. Again, there's some great ideas behind what reprocessing can do. It has not translated into the real world.
And Kemal, you mentioned that your attitude about the different technologies, because as I understand what we're describing here, there's a difference between what fuel type comes out of the reactor and the process that's then used to separate the component parts, and then what you produce afterward to recycle it. So there are a lot of criteria that one is looking at to understand and compare one reprocessing technology to another. You said you had kind of you've probably seen them all, working on different programs. How did your thinking evolve about the technology as you saw the technology kind of put through its paces?
Well, part of it was how quickly nuclear sector grew, and how much nuclear we really needed. And the other part of it is the type of reactors that we intended to use. Reprocessing to recycle the stuff back to light water reactors once, the way the French have done, didn't make much sense to me. You don't gain a lot. And at the end, you still have a lot of useful material that's sitting. Instead of being uranium oxide spent fuel, it becomes a MOX spent fuel, but it's still there. The introduction of the fast reactors, and by the way, Nick mentioned IFR. I think the very last well-defined program in United States was the IFR program. And it was within 5 to 6 years of basically demonstrating what it was set out to demonstrate, which is engineering scale, self-sustaining fuel cycle using fast reactors. It had nothing to do with burning down legacy waste and all that. It was just the self-sustaining nuclear plant. And it is, in my opinion, one of the bigger mistakes that we made in this country When we shut that program down in 1994, when we were, as I said, 5 to 6 years away from basically demonstrating what we were set out to demonstrate. It didn't mean we will build a whole bunch of fast reactors right away and start going in that direction. But technologically, we would have demonstrated and we would have anchored one solution to the problem that will be under our belt if we ever needed it. And today, as I said, in my opinion, we are needing it today. So depends on the reactors, depends on what our objectives are. Currently, we are sitting on 90,000 metric ton of spent fuel. Now, if we are going to reprocess, are we really going to go back and reprocess all that 90,000 metric ton of spent fuel? And if we do, what are we going to do with the output of it? Because we don't have enough reactors to take all that output. So those are the logistics that when you look into the problem, you need to consider, and it changes what technology you look at and what throughput you look at and how quickly, what kind of reactors you build. So the opinions change, and some of it is external factors, some of it is as we get closer to trying to do this. And one other comment I want to make, I think Rokasho experience has been painful for all of us to watch with Japan. I don't know how much of it was the very strict scrutiny that we were putting on the Japanese in terms of the safeguards that they needed to implement into that Rokasho that delayed things, and some of the technologies didn't work. But in terms of making it expensive, in terms of making the problem bigger, I would argue that the French will disagree with that. The French are still continuing to recycle, and they are still continuing to argue with us. Our numbers don't match, but they are still continuing to argue with us that it is cheaper for them to recycle, even ones to light water reactors, than getting rid of full fuel assemblies in the form of nuclear waste and trying to store them like that. So the national context change. And Russia is doing a very, very strategic recycling. So they don't recycle everything, but they recycle the stuff that they really want. So there is a path forward. We just need to do it smartly. And if we do it again, my request would be that this time let's just finish it, and let's not again do 5 years worth of a program and right before we can get something done.
This is always the
terminate it.
challenge in these infrastructure projects, is being able to see them through. And I think, understanding what has taken some of these prior projects off track is an important aspect to that. I want to go back. There's we've hit on the origins of the technology out of the Manhattan Project and some of the sort of proliferation concerns with the breeder reactors, the fast reactors, where they're designed to make more energy, if you will, than they consume. So I want to talk a little bit. Can we clarify for folks what former President Jimmy Carter can be blamed for, and where the stopping and starting of the American reprocessing program has? Because Kemal, you mentioned in 1994 the integral fast reactor program was stopped. There was another stopping point in the late 70s. Who would like to tackle that sort of those points, Nick, on the history? Yeah.
I mean, I can start. I'm sure everyone, you get the other guy, everyone knows a lot about these things, but just briefly. So when I mentioned that the U.S. government decided they're going to consolidate all their Atomic Energy Commission resources into the development of the breeder in 1969, and they did. They canceled like half dozen other reactor programs, like the molten salt reactor experiment and a bunch of high temperature gas ones. And so everybody focused on this Clinch River breeder, and it took over all the labs basically. And but it became unpopular, and Jimmy Carter sort of was a key part of that unpopularity. And he thought that, okay, maybe we don't want reprocessing because other people will see us doing it and they'll want to do it as well. Like if we reprocess, that's a sign that, hey, we like reprocessing, it's good for us, so other countries will want to do it as well. And he thought that that would then lead other countries to have a pathway to get closer to having weapons usable plutonium, sort of as a breakout opportunity from what looked like a civilian reprocessing situation. And so Jimmy Carter opposed the Clinch River breeder program, told the NRC to like hold up on the licensing. There was it became a massive political football. Jimmy Carter did an executive order that banned commercial reprocessing. And there was one facility there. Most of the reprocessing that we were doing in this country has always not been private. It's been like at Hanford or Savannah River, Idaho, or Oak Ridge. But there was one called there was Morris and West Valley and Barnwell that were never operated. They were planned and they were sort of half built, and then they were just never operated because they got canned by this particular executive order. Now, to this day, people online, every time you mention breeding, they say, oh, reprocessing is banned by Jimmy Carter, like to this day. But that's, of course, not true. Ronald Reagan unbanned it in 1981. So he kind of came in and said he was a fan. He wanted the breeder, but by that time, so he unbanned civilian reprocessing or private reprocessing, and he tried to get people to finish up the Clinch River. But at that point, it was too expensive, and Congress was just like, no, and they unfunded it, and that was sort of the end of that. So we haven't done reprocessing since then, privately, certainly. But it's not illegal, and it has been unbanned thanks to Reagan. So that's my contribution. Maybe others have something.
I don't know if anybody else wants to comment. Ross, I see you come.
Yeah, no, great overview, I think, Nick. I would, I think, zoom in a little bit on what Ronald Reagan did, what President Reagan did, which I think sometimes gets missed here, which, he said, no, we're not going to have a moratorium against reprocessing like what Jimmy Carter had enacted. So let's take that away. But we're also not going to turn reprocessing into a government boondoggle. This isn't going to be something that we're going to pour billions and billions of government subsidies into. So you want to reprocess, great, but it's going to have to compete in the free market. What we saw then is that reprocessing couldn't compete in the free market, and there were some real cost challenges. Nick mentioned Barnwell in particular is the one that comes to mind for me, the commercial facility in South Carolina. And they just couldn't make the numbers work. Completely agree. To this day, there is no ban on reprocessing in the United States. If a company wanted to come along and do reprocessing, they're welcome to do so. It just is not economically feasible, and that's why we haven't seen it.
Yeah. It's interesting because many of the communities that you and Nick are mentioning are ECA members and are familiar with these technologies, and that's why they're interested in, they have that knowledge base in their local communities. So figuring out how to put those facilities and that workforce back to some of these problems is, part of the, I think, interest that we see in these new EOs and the new companies that have this technology. Kemal, I know you had raised your hand there at one point.
Well, I was going to mention that, of course, non-proliferation for both the commercial reprocessing and eventually the demise of the IFR program, the non-proliferation has been an important policy discussion. But I would argue that West Valley operated for 10 years. But it was the first plant. It had a lot of problems. They had to shut down. And the reason they shut it down is to fix some of those problems, but also expand the capacity of the West Valley. But in 10 years, they processed about 600 metric tons of spent fuel or something. And from the non-proliferation standpoint, West Valley, unfortunately, I think was not necessarily just focused on commercial and to make the economics work. I think there was some defense work going on in there as well, which made people nervous about it, rightfully so. But the bigger problem was that when they shut down West Valley to do the upgrades, the entire regulatory infrastructure has changed around reprocessing. So in order to bring the plant back up online, they had to do really expensive upgrades. And as Ross mentioned, I think both Carter and Reagan, they did not necessarily support a big subsidies from the government to do that. And actually, I think I don't remember what their nuclear fuel something or other, the company that was running West Valley, they just walked away. They said, we are not going to do this anymore. Mm-hmm. So the government had to take over the whole thing and subsidize the whole thing. And they walked away from it. So non-proliferation on the policy side always comes to the front, but there was a lot of economic reasons to abandon some of those efforts as well.
Yeah, I think, Kemal, you raise an interesting question around, government investment in this technology from a competitive standpoint when these technologies are being operated in China and Russia. And that sort of strategic competition question is an important one that I want to get to later, because I recognize this is a huge topic and we're trying to cover a lot of ground. I also want to make sure that people who've tuned in have an opportunity to post questions. And if you would use the Q&A function, I'll start trying to weave some of those questions from the audience into the conversation as well. In the meantime, I wanted to also point out, we recently had the Supreme Court case ruling on interim storage in Texas. And even though this case doesn't directly involves storage, not reprocessing itself, the decision, the positive decision on behalf of, the Nuclear Regulatory's authority to license interim storage, what kind of, do you think it's required to have interim storage in order to have a reprocessing program that works in the United States?
I can start.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, it's certainly not required. Is it economical, or is it sort of like, is it efficient? I think it's probably a yes. I mean, right now that nuclear plant that was 9 miles from my house is long gone, decommissioned greenfield in like the late 90s, and the spent fuel is still sitting there with a bunch of guys. My friend's father-in-law is running the guard shack, and there's a bunch of guys out there getting paid a good salary to guard that fuel. So, and that's happening all over. So if there's obviously an economic argument for the interim storage, but you don't have to do that. We could keep paying that. We could keep paying for those people to be at those independent facilities all around the country and still set up reprocessing. I mean, certainly that is doable.
Any other opinions or thoughts on that?
Well, in my opinion, it depends on the scale on how we are going to do it. It's again, the current spent fuel inventory is 90,000 metric tons. And are we going to reprocess all that spent fuel? That objective needs to be very carefully thought about. And if we are going to reprocess and recycle all that, we have to think about that, what are we recycling it to, and where is that infrastructure? And we have to think about the transportation aspects of it. Today, the maximum we can transport in this country, and that was something that I've learned a few years ago on exactly what the constraints were. 3,000 metric ton a year is the maximum we can transport. So you take 90,000, assuming we don't generate any more, and 3,000 metric ton a year, that is 30 years. It's going to take 30 years to transport it from one place to another, wherever that place might be. So when you look at those kind of constraints, yes, if you are going to go in that kind of environment, and if you are going to do the reprocessing and recycling efficiently, collocating an interim storage, not the entire 90,000 metric ton, but a fraction of it, in a regional center, collocating that with a recycling facility and a reactor that will take the output of that recycling facility, that kind of a regional center, I think, is the most efficient way of doing this.
I think there are lots of members within the Energy Communities Alliance that see that pathway as a competitive and viable one. And I think that's part of what generated this conversation today and the interest in these issues. I mean, are there certainly the NRC's authority to license interim storage is going to be continue to get attention, and we'll see where that goes. Are there other policy issues that you think need to be resolved to see reprocessing successfully move forward in the United States?
I mean, as Ross was saying, like the economics are still not great, and people need some way to be able to improve that. So I guess policies that would allow some exploration, innovation in the technology might be appropriate to help with that. I mean, and we didn't talk much about why it's expensive, but you can imagine, it's highly radioactive, extremely radioactive material that you then take from generally solid form, which is well contained in little metal cans, and then you chop them off, melt it down, dilute it into this, it's different for different processes, but sort of traditionally, melt it down into this liquid and then start running chemistry on it. And there is a rich legacy of cleanup issues. That material can leak, it can get all over equipment, it can be hard to clean up, and it can move around and go critical in ways that are complicated and somewhat hazardous. So there's all these precautions you have to take, and everything has to be done remotely through 4-foot leaded glass type thing. So, but there are, we have better robots today, we have better process controls, we have much better materials. There's a lot of potential opportunity to take, there's plenty good processes in place now, but I mean, maybe something could be even better, or maybe something could be some kind of a breakthrough in actual economic and safety performance of reprocessing. So policy that would say like, hey, here's some spent fuel at a very small scale, and like we're gonna make some kind of an award. Whoever can reprocess this in a way that is somehow easily, much easier to keep track of, keep from spilling and keep from going critical, and like improve the economics by another factor of 10. That could be an interesting policy, or just environment in which that can be explored. Because as far as I know, we really aren't there. Like it's like, if right now the biggest problem in nuclear is that the economics of the plants is not competitive, and if you do add reprocessing right now, that does make them more expensive. So I kind of agree with Ross in that regard.
I see Ross and Kemal are
You're
both raising
jumping
their
in.
hands. I have a follow-up question from the Q&A too. So Kemal, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I want to touch the economics question, and it is based on everything we have done in the work for a 5% enriched uranium fuel, and reprocessing and recycling for 5% of the plutonium back into that light water reactor fuel. yes, indeed, for the on the U.S. side, it was we found out it was more expensive to do so. Again, the French will disagree, but the French math and the U.S. math on that one, they don't agree with each other. However, I think we gotta, as we look into the future, when we are talking about the economics, we have to consider two other things. One is high SALEU, 20% enriched uranium fuel, is going to be a lot more expensive than the 5% enriched light water reactor fuel. So enrichment is not cheap either. And going to 20% is going to change the economic equation. And two, I truly believe that when we are talking about economics, and we are comparing apples and oranges. Today, we still don't know what the disposal cost of spent fuel is. Yes, we have been charging the utilities 0.1 cent per kilowatt hour, and we thought that was more than enough to get rid of the waste in a once-through cycle and put it into a mountain. Well, today we know that wasn't enough money. That wasn't the real cost. The real cost is much bigger than that in the once-through fuel cycle. So we don't know exactly what the cost of the once-through fuel cycle is. So comparison is difficult. That's why I think until we understand what the total cost of nuclear waste is, and I'm talking about technology cost, system cost, as well as social cost, I think saying that reprocessing is always going to be more expensive, I think that is not the right approach to the problem.
I think it's an interesting point, and I always like to make the point to my colleagues in the energy sector that it's only nuclear that does this kind of cost accounting as well. But Ross, you've had your hand up for a while too.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's helpful to put this in question into a larger context, which is, look, we are at a point in time right now where we are going to be facing, for the first time in decades, large increase in electricity demand in the United States. A large part of this is, the expansion of AI. We have lots of data centers, right? That it certainly makes an awful lot of sense for us to be hosting in the United States, right? In order for us to be able to host these facilities, in order for us to be competitive on this really next generation, or I guess you could say now this generation of cutting edge technology, we have to have more electricity. We have to have it reliable. We have to have it quick, right? So I think that's the question we ought to be kind of trying to answer. The question of, reprocessing, and is there anything that we could do with reprocessing to have it be helpful rather than harmful? Well, there's an awful lot we need to do. We need to solve the cost issue, right? Again, if reprocessing, if someone wants to reprocess and it can compete in the market today, they're free to do it. It can't compete in the market, and so we're not. We need to solve for cost. We need to solve waste management. Reprocessing, I think, as Nick mentioned a little bit, instead of dealing with the intact spent fuel bundles, you're dissolving the spent fuel, you're creating all sorts of new waste streams. That's another issue we need to tackle. We need to tackle the non-proliferation and security issue. So there's an awful lot that we need to tackle. The problem is, by the time we're only halfway towards solving these problems, we're already at 2050. We've lost the AI race. Reprocessing here is not part of the immediate solution. So might there be still some kind of R&D efforts looking more into the future? Can some of these problems perhaps be solved? Perhaps. But they're not, in my view, a prudent part of the real commercial deployment that we need to be starting on yesterday.
Well, and I think one of the questions in the chat too is, why can't the US adopt this full fuel cycle as has been done in other countries? There are countries that have full reprocessing, And you and Kemal have demonstrated that there are competing numbers in terms of the success of those programs. And Kemal, I see you've got your hand up. Did you want to
Oh,
weigh in
no,
on
no,
this?
no. That is,
Yeah.
I forgot to lower my hand.
No,
So,
that's okay. That's okay. But I think that international race is also relevant in terms of people's sense of urgency to seeing these technologies come forward. I think one thing I want to clarify from the Q&A, when we talk about recycling versus reprocessing, is there, can these words be used interchangeably, or are we actually talking about different technologies?
So, oh, go ahead, Kamal.
oh, go ahead. Go
Everybody's
ahead.
got a
I mean,
comment, so we'll go
maybe
down
everyone
the
has a
line.
feeling on it. Like, yeah, one is a euphemism of the other. Like, there are different versions of the terms, and there are different levels of separations versus just chopping the clad off and putting new clad on it. But in general, I think, like, to the normal public, reprocessing, recycling, separations are largely talking about the same thing,
Yeah.
even though there's
And
nuance.
and so when you talk, the cladding would be the casing for the fuel that gets chopped up, and
Yeah, there's some fringe operations where like you would just chop the clad up, pull the fuel out, and then put a new metal around it. And in that case, you're not really melting anything down. But no one there's this process. There's a DUPIC process that the Canadians talk about sometimes. But it's like really it's hard. No one's ever really done it, and you don't get much benefit from it. So in general, I think it's safe to say that like reprocessing and recycling are like, and some people call it polishing. Like there's all sorts of people are, oh no, that has bad connotation. Let's change the word a little. This happens all the time.
well, but I think it also I think it's more than it's more significant than just wordplay in that the processes are different. And I think one of the questions in the Q&A relates to the waste streams. What types of low level or high level waste streams are being created, and do we have disposal pathways? So if I'm an elected official and I'm trying to assess one technology over another, how do I formulate these questions? So Ross, I see you and Kemal both have hands up.
I
So
think Ross was first.
okay.
Sure. Yeah. On the question of recycling and reprocessing, I have a slightly different view, which is I see recycling as the goal of reprocessing. So reprocessing is this process that Nick laid out, right? You take your spent fuel, you dissolve it, you separate it into its constituent parts. That's the reprocessing, right? The recycling then would be actually reusing the plutonium, the uranium in reactors. And so what we've seen, this relates to your question about the international experience, Laura. What we've seen is, yes, there's been some programs that have done quite a bit of reprocessing. There's actually been relatively little recycling that has gone on. And so, you know, oftentimes you might hear in the reprocessing argument that, you know, over 90% of our spent fuel can be reused and it's a resource. What we've seen in the countries that have reprocessed is, you know, oftentimes less than 1% is actually being recycled. Even in the case of France, which, you know, is kind of often kind of propped up as a great paradigm for reprocessing or recycling, only about 1 to 2% of their reprocessed material is actually being recycled. So I think there's still an awful lot that needs to be figured out in order to actually turn the reprocessing into recycling.
Okay. Kemal.
Yeah, I think I was gonna mention the same thing that Ross did. To me, the difference between reprocessing and recycling is reprocessing is just breaking the fuel up into different components. Recycling is actually to use it, and in order to use it, first you have to convert it to a fuel form. So a recycling plant is it has a reprocessing side to it, but attached to it, there's the fuel fabrication plant as well. So whatever you separated, especially the plutonium and uranium, you convert it to a fuel, and then you have to have a reactor to accept that fuel. Now, the French problem was that that reactor was supposed to be fast reactors accepting that fuel, but since the fast reactor program didn't advance quickly enough, then they had to recycle it back to light water reactors. That's why they can only use 1 or 2% of it. But there's an added benefit to it, though, that we shouldn't forget, is that during that process, they create new waste forms. So their spent fuel is no longer just old fuel assemblies stuck into a canister. They have a vitrified waste form. Now, from our perspective, since we don't exactly know the repository, and there is a lot of push also for boreholes to be an alternative to repository, now those canisters containing vitrified waste are a lot more amenable to be disposed of in boreholes, as opposed to those big, huge canisters being thrown into boreholes that, in my opinion, is totally unrealistic. So it does open another avenue for waste disposal as well, whatever is left after reprocessing.
Yeah. So, I mean, this goal of why reprocessing, what is the goal? Like, what are we actually trying to accomplish with it? This point that Ross was making, I think is an important one. And someone's brought up in the Q&A the experience at West Valley and how it separates, if you think about reprocessing in terms of separating spent fuel into uranium and plutonium, the second part of it is all of the additional constituents, the fission products that are separated out as well. Kemal, I think that's the point that you're drawing attention to in terms of some of the new waste streams. And the experience at West Valley, there's been a lot written, and there's some stuff on the ECA website about that. But if we think about it as where we can take sort of lessons learned, what questions do we need to be thinking about in terms of waste form properties, and how that gets addressed when we think about, okay, we have these advanced reactor technologies coming forward. How does that change the waste conversation that we've been having nationally for years?
Yeah, not sure if it fully answers the question, but this does come up all the time where people are like, no, don't make a permanent waste, don't make a geologic repository because we're going to recycle all of that. And so it's like you have anti-nuclear people saying like, don't make a permanent repository because then we can't beat the nuclear industry over the head with the fact that they haven't solved nuclear waste anymore, which was official written policy in the anti-nuclear policy statement from the early 90s. And then on the other hand, you have, like I go out and talk to people in public, and their biggest concern still is, what about the waste? And so a lot of me wants to say, even though I think we can reprocess and need to reprocess at some point, I would love to see a full geologic repository up and running in every nuclear country, just to show, we've all said, oh, it's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. Well, let's solve the political problem. Let's get one up and running, show that the community supports it and benefits from it. We're going to need a relatively long-term repository anyway, even if you do reprocess. There's always process losses. Like when you're doing any kind of recycling or reprocessing industry, you're going to have some of these long-lived materials that don't get into the spent fuel and still will be in a waste stream. And so having a long-term repository would be beneficial. So I have this fight all the time with the pro reprocessing people. It's like, just build the spent fuel repository. Now they would argue, okay, well, if you reprocess, the waste goes down much faster and you only need a repository that lasts for 500 years instead of 10 or 100,000. And there is some truth to that if you aggressively reprocess and capture 99.99% of the long-lived actinides, curiums and americiums and so on. But the likelihood of doing that anytime anytime soon is, I think, very low. And so just having that repository around is going to be a benefit. So again, I don't think it fully answers your question, but that's like a huge aspect of this debate that comes up. You can have both. Like you can you can put spent fuel in a repository now and still reprocess later. It's not like there isn't still a ton of uranium and thorium that we can dig up. Even if we were to dispose of 100% of our spent fuel right now, we could still have a flourishing nuclear industry if we started recycling in whatever, 20 years.
Kemal, did you want to add to this?
No, I agree with what he's saying. I don't think one excludes the other one. I think Nick is absolutely right. No matter what we do, we are gonna need a disposal pad, whether that's a borehole or a repository. Yes, the volumes change, the nature of the waste change, but we are gonna need it. And that's why I think if we are gonna go forward with and consistent with the new presidential orders, very large expansion in nuclear energy, partially reprocessing. We have to have a national roadmap on exactly when the different pieces will come into play and how we are going to integrate it. If we look at the problem, if we look at each tree without looking at the forest, I think we are going to make the same mistake that we've been making for the last 40, 50 years. I think we got to define the forest first, which has all those elements. And then we can start discussing which specific technologies we are going to use. And in my opinion, those are going to be regional technologies that each region is not going to use the same technology for doing the same thing. Some parts will have high temperature gas reactors, therefore the fuel cycle over there is going to be different. Some parts are going to be heavily fast reactors. Some parts will continue to use light water reactors.
So that's an interesting vision, Kemal, with of the future with different reactors in different regions. I think if one of the questions in the chat, I think it's a nice step to this question around the different technologies, and are there types of reprocessing that would be better or worse from a proliferation perspective? Are there some reprocessing techniques that are considered proliferation resistance? Or how would you approach it from that way, from that perspective?
Ross, you want to start with that one?
Yeah, sure. What I would say is the reprocessing technologies that we're looking at right now, none of them would be considered proliferation resistant. Largely we have two bins of reprocessing technologies, we call it aqueous process or a Purex process, or various modifications of this process. This is what's being used in Japan and in France. What the United Kingdom did. This is what's really been deployed around the world. And then the other one that is getting quite a bit of attention these days, but has never really been deployed commercially, is pyroprocessing. And it's just slightly different ways of extracting these materials. Now, I think sometimes there is an argument that's thrown out that somehow pyroprocessing is more proliferation resistant than the aqueous reprocessing. But we've studied this quite carefully, and what we found is that's not really the case. Several of our national labs dug into this. NNSA, the National Nuclear Security Administration, dug into this. And what they did is they looked at different different reprocessing technologies, and went even further, I think, and looked at different nuclear technologies and graded them on a scale of A to Z in terms of proliferation resistance, with A being the most proliferation resistant, the best, so to speak, Z being the least proliferation resistant, or kind of the biggest challenge. And what was found is that the aqueous reprocessing most of them fell into category Z, so that's not great. And pyroprocessing fell into W. So is it a little bit better than the Z? Yeah, a little bit. But the analysis also showed that not meaningfully better. We're looking at that area on an A to Z scale from W to Z. Now, what I will say is I think the technology that not reprocessing, but what you could call perhaps a recycling technology that Nick mentioned he worked on earlier in his career, this kind of like, what could be called in situ recycling, or the deep burn once through is I think how Nick put it. But what TerraPower was looking to do with their traveling wave technology, and can you try and recycle some of this without reprocessing? That I think is really interesting. I'm sure Nick can talk more about it and the technical challenges that come along with that. But that's what I'd say in terms of the proliferation angle on all this.
Yeah, and yeah, it's a challenge, right? The company said their current project is not the traveling wave technology because they're still developing the fuel that will be capable of doing that, and it just takes longer. So maybe possible sort of TBD based on fuel irradiation performance. And so it is hard to leave fuel in a reactor for many years. And I just want to add to the broader point as well, like I think the proliferation resistance, like if you bring out the plutonium with a couple other actinides, it just isn't that hard to go in there chemically and pull the plutonium out. So like this idea that it's much better or worse, I think I generally agree with Ross. I think the solution to proliferation concern is what we do at all reactors, which is inspections and safeguards. So you would continue doing inspections and safeguards under the IAEA, and they would track your tracking and inventory just like they do with a reactor. And that'll be required for fusion as well, because when you have a bunch of fusion neutrons, you can always stick a little stick of thorium or uranium-238 out there and make some plutonium. So inspections and safeguards are the solution, and I don't think there's much else you can do for proliferation. There's another issue that comes up a lot. I just want to briefly mention, which is that a lot of people say, oh, if you have a lot of plutonium-240 in the fuel, then it's not a proliferation concern because it's reactor-grade plutonium instead of weapons-grade plutonium, and it's going to pre-detonate. This is like weapons stuff. Well, that's not really the case anymore. We used to think that you had to be a very sophisticated weapons designer to get around pre-detonation, but we now know that even North Korea has developed gas-boosted, tritium-boosted fission weapons that are completely impervious to pre-detonation. And so this idea of reactor-grade plutonium being somehow less of a concern is now outdated. You can make a weapon out of effectively pure plutonium-240, and you don't have to be all that sophisticated. So it's a sub point, and
Thanks.
so again, inspections and safeguards are the answer to proliferation.
I think too, it also begs the question, if there are in the UK, Japan, France, China, Russia, active programs, do we fall further behind if we don't start operating these technologies ourselves with the knowledge and the know-how? But Kemal, you have your hand up, so I want to make sure I get you in.
Well, I was gonna go in that direction also. Now we are talking about proliferation, but proliferation. If we define proliferation as a state using commercial operations as a disguise to develop weapons, if that is what we are worried about, proliferation is not an issue in the United States. We are already a weapon state. We have tons of excess plutonium that we are trying to get rid of. So we are not looking to create more plutonium. We are trying to get rid of the plutonium that we already have. So in the United States, proliferation is not the issue. The argument has been that, well, if we do it, others will do it too. And to that, I think the answer is what Nick articulated, is safeguards. There is no technology out there. Once you dissolve the fuel, you can always manipulate the technology to take the plutonium out of it. The original design may have other things in it, but a smart chemist will know how to manipulate it and change it. However, manipulating the process and the process flow sheets has a lot of signatures. And those signatures can easily be detected by the safeguards. And if it is being done under the safeguards, especially today with the advance of artificial intelligence and different data algorithms that people can use, if that is properly implemented, then I don't think reprocessing creates any additional proliferation concern compared to enrichment. Enrichment is the easier way to go, and we have seen that demonstrated. And fast reactors, to the best of my knowledge, breeding in fast reactors has never been used to create a weapon, even in United States. It was always specialized reactors that created that. So proliferation, we have to look at the proliferation differently than what we've been talking about in the last 20, 30 years.
Okay. Yeah. And I also want to tie back to the waste issue, because I think ultimately, this interest in reprocessing that we've seen within the Energy Communities Alliance really relates back to the potential for consolidated interim storage and whether or not reprocessing becomes another pathway to kind of help us resolve that big question that's much closer to home in terms of what do we do with the 70 sites that are storing spent fuel today. Ross, I want to give you a chance to comment on the proliferation concerns before we go back to the waste issue.
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of great issues here on the table, so I'll just very quickly comment on a couple of them. The importance of safeguards, I want to just comment on that real quick. So we've always had this layered approach to nuclear security and non-proliferation. Safeguards play an extremely important role, but they're not sufficient by themselves. And so, the first layer is really taking weapons usable material out of the fuel cycle. Then we have safeguards to, really what safeguards do is they make it really hard for a country to move towards weaponization without being detected, right? The safeguards is really about detection, right? It's not about prevention, really. It's about detection. And so if we had a situation where countries all around the world have weapons usable nuclear material and it's safeguarded, again, the safeguards is not going to prevent these countries from weaponizing. If they wanted to move towards a weapon, they could then do so very quickly. Might it be detected? Might safeguards detect it? Yes, maybe. But at that point, they already have a weapon. Again, safeguards very important, but it can't be done by itself. It doesn't solve the issue of proliferation by itself. And then just very quickly, Laura, to answer your questions about is the United States at risk of falling behind? There are other countries that are working on reprocessing technology. Should we be doing the same? I would say the only thing we're at risk of falling behind on is losing lots of money towards a technology that isn't working very well. So where we've seen reprocessing deployed, again, it's just the track record is really poor. So I think this is an area where we can actually lead. We can get ahead of our geopolitical rivals by not reprocessing and by really leaning into that once through fuel cycle.
That's an interesting point. Thanks, Ross. I think one of the questions here in the chat or in the Q&A also related to some of the new technologies and the innovation. There's been a lot of research and development on reprocessing over the last 50 years. And so what new technologies are on the horizon that might address some of these, whether it's proliferation issues or cost issues, or also, I'll stop there.
I mean, Yeah, I'm sure there's lots of others that I'm not even aware of, but people publish all sorts of cool ideas. There was an idea maybe 20 years ago that was like, I don't know if it helps with proliferation or cost, but it was like use plasma. So take the spent fuel. This is like a Hanford cleanup thing. Vaporize it into a plasma and then like use magnets to separate the different ions out. This is called like an Archimedes filter. It had a funny name, but that certainly doesn't really help with the proliferation concern. Obviously, it was thought to maybe help with the economics in that particular case, but certainly like there are companies out there saying we are going to reprocess. We're going to own and operate reprocessing plants. Oklo comes to mind. At least they used to. I think they still say that. They have small fast reactors on their own, which small fast reactors are not fuel efficient on their own. But if you reprocess, you could bring down the cost of reprocessing. Sure, you could come up with a case for like you just keep going back and forth between the small fast reactor and the reprocessing plant. And so, like, what exactly is that reprocessing technology? They've been talking about just picking up where EBR2 left off, which is the pyro process as sort of perfected by the IFR program that Kemal was talking about earlier. So anyway, I'm sure there's many more, but like it doesn't look like there's a step change in terms of economics or proliferation concern, at least that I'm aware of. And like in the United States, the number is that reprocessing is generally considered to be about it'll make sense once uranium ore costs 3 times what it does now. But Kamal's point earlier that like if you have these advanced reactors that are so neutronically inefficient that they need HALEU, they need this higher assay or medium enriched uranium, then that calculus, that number will change. It'll be like, because now all of a sudden, whereas in the current reactor, fuel may be 5 to 10% of the total cost. In an advanced reactor that has very expensive fuel, fuel may be 90% of the cost, at which point reprocessing certainly would make more sense. So it may be just like shifting reactor styles and to a more neutronically inefficient reactor that causes reprocessing to become like relevant again from an economics point of view.
Thanks, Nick, for addressing one of the questions in the chat around what would the cost of uranium have to get up to make reprocessing cost competitive.
Yep.
I realize that we only have 3 minutes
Oh,
left, and so I want to just alert everybody to the time. I knew we weren't going to be able to cover all of the topics that we wanted to, but I think we've covered a lot of ground. I think, as we have a chance to kind of give some final thoughts on this, I don't want this question to get lost in terms of how are we going to do this reprocessing more mindfully this time around to make sure that we're not making a mess that needs to be cleaned up either by private companies or by taxpayers. And so I think that part of our goal today was to cover some of the details in the history. As we think about moving forward, what advice would you have to people that are looking at these technologies and as potentially coming to their communities and making sure that they're asking good questions, that the waste that might be generated has a good place to go? In 3 minutes or less, please.
Well, let me start very quickly. My advice is to do the mass flow very carefully on exactly what comes in, what goes out, how it goes out, what remains, and not try to solve the entire problem all at once, but take bite-sized chunks in a coordinated way, so that each chunk is not is coordinated with the other chunk, but each community, each region, or takes whatever they can chew.
Great.
Yeah, and I just back that up, like demand transparency. Don't let someone come in and do a shiny dance about how cool it's going to be. Ask them what's the effluent, like how many nuclides and like how regularly, and then put sensors out there and keep them accountable. Like don't let people just give you the marketing spiel. Get into the details, demand details, get the process flow, and then hold accountable through detection. The nice thing about radiation is you can detect a single atom decaying and you know which atom it was, so you can find it if they're leaking. So put that in place right up front.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Ross.
Yeah, I mean, very little to add to what Nick just said there. Look, I think folks in the communities are really smart. and understand that there's a lot of slick pitches, but you really have to dig into the details to understand whether what's being promised is actually deliverable or not. And I'm very confident that they'll be asking the right questions.
Well, and we look forward to posing some of those questions back to you gentlemen in the future. I know how to reach you and appreciate you taking time to share your knowledge today. I want to thank everybody who tuned in to our webinar. Like I said, this will be on the ECA YouTube channel here in a couple of weeks. And certainly if you have other questions, I know we didn't get to everything that people posted today. We will try to address these in some of our future seminars. And with that, I will thank everybody again for your time today.
Yeah, thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
you.